Welcome to my little video tutorial on surveillance capitalism and the digital economy. My name is Sarah Spiekermann and I am a professor for business informatics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. When internet economics is discussed today, then the primary asset that is being discussed is data. In particular, personal data. Personal data is said to be the new oil of the digital economy. But what does it actually mean? And why are so many intellectuals, NGOs, politicians, and even some industry players skeptical about this new trend? I would like to explain the dynamics and role of personal data in today's economics in this talk and give you an insight into the surveillance machinery of the digital economy. Now, in doing so, I would like to acknowledge up front that I have been greatly inspired in my reflections by Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism. It was published in 2019 and it contained an earlier version of the graphic that you see here on the slide. An overview of the mechanics of personal data use and abuse, which I allowed myself to marginally improve and refine and extend for the purpose of this lecture. Now, let's start with the observation that there are two parts to our economy now. First, the primary economy that we used to know, in which products and services are produced and improved, and where we, ordinary customers, buy these services. And secondly, a new shadow economy that is not producing physical goods and services for us end customers, but is producing knowledge about us that allows, unfortunately, to manipulate us in certain behaviors. To understand this in more detail, let's walk through this graphic and its two parts slowly. I start with the primary economy on the bottom. One of the most important economists of the primary economy and its digital dynamics is Hal Varian, an emeritus professor at the University of California in Berkeley and chief economist of Google since 2007. In 2010, Hal Varian published an analysis of computer-mediated transactions in the American Economic Review that emerged to be a classic of internet economics teaching. In this article, he showed how 4 digital novelties impact economic dynamics. First, new ways of data extraction analysis. Secondly, new forms of contract. Third, controlled experimentation. And fourth, personalization, customization of services. Let me explain in more detail with an example what the primary digital economy is all about. Take speech assistants like Amazon Alexa or Apple Siri or Google Assistant. When a person speaks with such an agent, a lot of behavioral user data is generated. So you see here the little blue circling in the graphic. A new form of data extraction is happening as a result of the new technology. The raw speech profiles that are collected by the agent's microphones are sent to the network edge, the data centers of the respective service provider, to be understood and to generate an individually customized response of the agent. This speech data contains a lot of information needed by the service provider in order to now improve and adapt the service. In fact, the proper recognition of human language is a huge challenge for speech assistants, and a lot of data analytics is required in order to improve the ability of the device to perfectly understand us human users. Many different versions of speech recognition algorithms need to be tested in controlled experimentation in order to improve the service over time. So data analytics is used to adapt a service over time, often with us users testing various software versions as part of experiments. Experiments, however, that we do not know about or recognize or are aware of, which has been criticized by many intellectuals, NGOs, etc. Finally, new forms of contract become also possible through digitization. It has become possible, for instance, not to charge customers for hardware so much anymore, but only for the use of the service. In essence, this is how Hal Varian described the dynamics of internet economics that was prominent throughout the first decade of the internet going mainstream. However, the dynamics of new forms of data extraction, personalization, experimentation, and contracting enabled also a whole new breed of additional commercial activities. Zuboff calls these the shadow economy. And this shadow economy is not at all as positive for our societies and economies as one would hope. What is happening here? First of all, quite a lot of companies in the digital ecosystem have started to engage in so-called data sharing agreements. It means that a speech assistant provider could, for example, pool his data sets with other providers of data sets. A made-up example is that the data on households' speech profiles could be pooled with the data on where the household resides physically. What kind of luxury home or poor dwelling a family might possess based on its suburban address. This pooling of data is easy technically, because when the family bought the speech assistant, let's say online, a delivery address needed to be given, and for each physical address there exist today commercially available databases which detail the demographic status of households. So you just share and aggregate the data, and you know much more about the speech assistant user than by just listening to their voice commands. In addition, the speech profile can be analyzed for further traits. For example, how many people are living in the respective households, seen the different voices. It could be analyzed whether people have an accent and whether their language is sophisticated or rather marked by poor vocabulary. Moreover, the speech profile also tells a lot about the state of a person. A hoarse voice can indicate that someone has caught the flu, or a low voice might mean that someone might be depressed. All of this extra information that is implicit in the behavioral user data, accent, language, sophistication, voice tonality, etc., is what Zuboff calls data exhaust. So a major takeaway is that companies are often not staying in the primary service domain, but engage in additional data sharing activities. Why is this sharing of data being done? Let's presume that a speech assistant provider wants to sell advertisements through its device. The speech assistant could offer the household owner, Bob, with a low voice, an antidepressive medication, or suggest to him a visit to a new spiritual support center around the corner. For such a targeted ad to be reliable, however, and correct, it is not enough to just process and analyze Bob's voice data on condition that is going in from the speech assistant. Additional information about him is needed. The motion data from his phone sensors, for instance, might be good to consider as a second variable to infer the likelihood of depression. If he did not move much in past days, perhaps it's an indication for him being not on top of himself. Bob's recent absence from work can also be inferred from his phone with help of location data. The emojis he used in his messaging applications can be an indicator of his state. And finally, suggesting to him the right support center around the corner requires the speech assistant to know in what town or town area he lives. So taken together, the example illustrates that quite a lot of external data is needed and must be aggregated and integrated first in order to then reliably infer something about a human person, such as Bob and his health status. This integration and aggregation of data to target the messages reaching people is done by so-called data management platforms today. At this point, one might wonder how often this kind of inferences are actually being made about us. Is this just science fiction and speculation, probability to do something like that? What size is this digital data accumulation and economy? In my book, Networks of Control, that I co-authored with Vienna activist Prof. in 2016, we presented over 600 case studies on how firms cooperate, share, and aggregate data across borders about hundreds of millions of people that may not even be online in order to be part of the data sets. Unsurprisingly, the companies involved here are not publicly talking so much about what they do. But according to Crystal's research, the Oracle company Bluekai, for example, said that it can pull 30,000 user attributes from 200 different data providers to complete 700 million user profiles. The company Axiom said that they can equally profile 700 million consumers with 3,000 attributes per person. And these are only the rather unknown companies in this business when compared to players such as Google or Facebook, who everyone knows about that they are collecting a lot of data. So the scale of personal information that is being aggregated and analyzed about us people here is enormous. And unfortunately, there is no law that currently protects us from this surveillance apparatus. In contrast, the business of aggregating information about people and creating inferences are considered as a trade secret by the corporate actors involved. And in a clever move, they were probably not inactive to ensure that the EU just passed a new trade secret directive in 2016. It became active in 2018, that protects companies' rights to continue working in this shadow. If you thought that you might be protected against this practice if you're European, and in Europe we have the European Data Protection Regulation, then you should know that GDPR does not protect you, which is why legal experts are demanding now the citizens' right to reasonable inferences and call for more transparency and protection against this massive surveillance machinery. But let me come back to the economic dynamics here. As I explained, there is a market for product and service advertisement here involving data management platforms that help inferring information about people. These inferences are then packaged for advertisement purpose in the form of prediction products that can be sold on markets and future behavior. What does such a market for future behavior look like in practice? A speech assistant provider like Amazon or Google could offer a market for advertisement slots on which the ideal moment is sold to send a person a specific message. For example, the ideal moment to send a person an ad for cough sweets is when this person is likely to have a cold, which you know from the voice. Or the ideal moment for sending an ad for an antidepressive is when the person is predicted to be in low state. So these ideal moments to reach the ideal consumers for one's products are auctioned off to the best betting advertiser. In Zuboff's terminology, prediction products are sold, auctioned off, on markets in future behavior. And those advertisers buying these ideal moments are, of course, paying a fee for the slot, which is how surveillance revenues are generated. Of course, all these dynamics need to be integrated in a present and appealing user interface. If you take a fresh example, like the Pokemon Go, this can be summarized one more time. Data management platforms have the information about the food purchases of Pokemon Go players and many other information. Bob, for instance, take him again as an example, often goes to McDonald's and consumes Coke as well as pizza. That can be seen from his loyalty cards. So it can be inferred about Bob that he is a burger lover. Moreover, it can be predicted that burger lovers who find a Pokemon in a McDonald's store are more likely to stay around to have one. So McDonald's can purchase the ideal slot to have Pokemons hidden in their outlets the moment a playing person like Bob, a burger lover, is close by. The hidden Pokemon in the McDonald's has to be shown in the game, of course, so this needs to be integrated in the service. And the moment then Bob enters the restaurant, he creates what is called footfall, which means that he's actually behaved as was predicted. And for this conversion, of course, an advertiser might be asked to pay another small premium. Now you might be more or less at ease with this whole development of the digital economy in recent years. Defenders of the system argue that after all, Pokemon players get burgers when and where they like, and pharmaceutical advice and deliveries also just in time. This sounds like a lot of comfort. So why are critics of this machinery so vocal and so alert? There are several arguments that I want to present before I close. The first one, the most important one, perhaps, is that this whole cycle is currently massively abused. If you hear today that politicians discuss the problem of fake news, then many have not understood that a very important part of the fake news problem of digital political influence, of information warfare, is actually due to this shadow market of personal data collection, inferences, and distribution. This is because just as ad advertisement is sent to the ideal customers, also false information is sent to the ideal recipients, that is, those who are ready to believe it and radicalize. Let me take the Trump election as an example. Here, Cambridge Analytica was the company that could pool and aggregate data from various sources, including people's personality type, voting behavior, residence, etc. in experiments, they found that narcissistic swing voters would be that group which could determine the outcome of the election. Convincible to vote for Trump if targeted at the right moment. So Cambridge Analytica inferred who of the reachable voting population would be best suited to receiving news having these traits, and on Trump that plays into narcissism and swing voting behavior. This knowledge seems to have been sold to Trump's campaign team or some other intermediaries, but for sure it ended up in Facebook's service that duly channeled the highly targeted messages to these potential voters. Similarly, voters who were inferred to be Catholic were predicted to vote for Trump if they see a message saying that Pope Francis would also vote for Trump. This message was integrated in the Facebook service, and soon all of these manipulated little ideal voters were showing footfall on election day. Because this whole data economy, data collection, inferencing, predicting, and distributing is happening today at massive scale, in the shadow, totally intransparently, it is the ideal for massive abuse. All of this is also happening without people knowing about these practices. Even if they knew, they would have no rights to protect themselves from this. That is, they lose their privacy and fall prey to full-fledged surveillance mechanisms that are in no way less organized than the Chinese citizen score that so many people in the Western world are criticizing these days, while effectively the digital economy works more or less in the same way. People's personal data assets are flowing into this economy without them knowing, which effectively breaches their informational self-determination, a fundamental right recognized. One might reason, of course, that in Europe, people give their consent to this data processing. They're notified, they have a choice. But when they're pressing the OK button on the privacy notice, are they really exercising a self-determinism? Are they freely participating? Shoshana Zuboff notes such clicking of consent boxes are no contracts. In fact, she uses the term uncontract to describe the fact that there is no possibility for users then clicking OK on their data usage, because in many cases they're not allowed to use the service otherwise. And if they were allowed and read all the contracts presented to them, then they would need to spend roughly 19 days in a year. That is almost 4 full working weeks to read them, which is irrational and not irrational to do. So there is an absence of structural reciprocities between the firm and its population, as Zuboff writes. And this lack of structural reciprocity can have other negative effects for markets. Not only do people who learn about this lose trust in the companies who participate in this system, but also a lack of respect for contracts may arise. If people get habituated to signing on contracts 5 times a day at the least, at the end, contracts don't matter to them anymore. This would be a disastrous consequence for an economy that relies on the respect of contracts. Habituation brings me to the last and largest criticism of this whole system. How do you think we as people are changing if we get used to this undignified cycle of surveillance and manipulation? Do we become experimental rats whose conditions are determined by the kind of company Cambridge Analytica is, working for people in power who have their own agendas? What does it do to us when we learn to accept that we are constantly surveyed by hundreds of services who observe us based on uncontracts we sign, sell our personality profiles, infer and spread a lot of partly demeaning, partly false information about us. Do we care? Are we already in a post-privacy age and don't care? Let me tell you what I care about and believe that most people should care about, no matter how little they may become concerned about a shadow economy. What we care about is the effects of this. We care about people like Trump getting into power this way. We care about Brexit that happened in this way. And we also care when all this data is used to our disadvantage, because it is integrated in new forms of contracts with services like insurance. When it is used to determine job candidates, when it influences our court decisions, when it is used for predictive policing, for employment services, etc. This use of the shadow economy's data for all kinds of services that deeply affect us in our lives is something we should care about. Thank you very much for your attention.